Hello, my name is Dr. Liz Burton-Crow. I'm the Director of Education for the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, our monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision of a future in which humans and other animals live as one community in peace and wellness. Given all that's unfolded in the past year, these conversations are more important than ever. For they are more than mere conversations. They are opportunities for building community, salve for the isolating wounds of our time. Through Living One, together we attempt to answer the question, we know it's wrong, but what does right look like? Joining us today to help us answer that question is Olivia Crossman. She's an environmental studies junior at Loyola University Chicago in the School of Environmental Sustainability. She is also minoring in Spanish and is a member of the Interdisciplinary Honors Program. Over the last 2 years, Olivia has been involved in the school's Student Environmental Alliance, working on the plastic-free initiative to promote a zero-waste lifestyle on campus. As a senior at Oak Park and River Forest High School, Olivia took Investigative Research Design Innovation, where students spent the year designing and carrying out an original research project that aimed to fill a gap in existing literature. Olivia's focus was on the effect of trauma on elephant reproduction rates. At the end of the year, students engaged in competitions with their research in the Chicago area. In the summer of 2020, Olivia completed the Carrillo Center's Animal Being Internship. In this work, she utilized a cross-species lens to explore animal cognition, emotions, and experience. She also studied primary and secondary literature, detailing the series of specific scientific discoveries and principles that promoted a species-common approach to the study of human and animal minds and emotions. Additionally, Olivia explored the main philosophical, political, social, ethical, and psychological issues that have emerged with trans-species psychology. And interviewing Olivia today is our very own Dr. Gabe Bradshaw.
Hi, thank you, Liz, and welcome everyone. This is, it's always exciting, but this is exciting because Olivia and I first met, I don't know how many years ago, but it's a wonderful celebration in terms of our own interactions and discussions. Olivia, typically what I do is I ask the speakers just to get everyone sort of on, at least not in the same page, but at least in the same volume. Just tell us a little bit about the arc in your life that has brought you to the work that you're doing and the philosophical foundations that you embrace.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Also, I'm so excited. I guess my arc probably began, before I can even really remember. I've always been like a very highly sensitive person. And as a kid, I really remember just having these moments with animals, nature, other people, and also just like objects that sorry, my dog is coming to say hello. And just like objects, I guess, that were meaningful to me in my life. And over time, I guess, as I got older, I was trying to kind of understand what these connections and sensitivities, I guess, were, where they came from, where they like originated. And it's actually funny, when I was probably 5 or 6 years old, my dad likes to tell this story. I was like sitting in the back seat of the car with him, and I just kind of looked at him and I was like, what is everything? And he was like, I don't know how to answer that for you. And thinking back on that, I guess it really was my kind of attempt to like understand why I felt so connected, I guess, to the things around me that weren't necessarily the people around me. And that is all to say that the biggest like psychological conceptual shift for me has been understanding that these like connections and sensitivities and this empathy that I have, I guess, is really stems from my sense of connection to nature and to the earth and like the environment. And I definitely did not really understand that as a kid. So growing up and becoming more involved in the environmental movement, whether that's through what I'm studying in school or through my work with Carlos and you guys. I've come to kind of understand that that's really where all of this started for me, is just feeling very like connected to the earth, and that connection was really important for me, and a huge foundation, I think, for who I am as like a person, and how I relate even to other people. So I think that really has been the arc up to this point. I mean, I'm really still just starting, but that's been a pretty big psychological shift for me, is understanding that that is the root of all of it, I guess.
It's so fascinating because something that's on so many people's minds, and then you see it in the literature, in the media, people wanting humans, wanting to, how do we reconnect? We're just so disconnected. Our lives are so disconnected with nature. Our lives are disconnected even with each other. And so there's this real yearning and urge, and a lot of times kind of panic, particularly like with climate change and the extinctions and everything. So it's really fascinating to hear that you're talking about being connected already. And the other thing is that when, and again, not everyone, but a number of people do comment and then said, well, when I was a kid, it was really different. They described something like the way you're talking about it. And then blah, 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 things happened in my life. Now, can you reflect on, now you've graduated, with this very, excelled in your high school work, secondary work, and you're in university. Are you encountering, and if so, what are they, these kinds of challenges for disconnection, or these seductions of disconnection from your very foundational sense of oneness?
Absolutely. I think probably the biggest obstacle in that sense would be just like the kind of nagging despair that's always just kind of creeping its way in. That I think is, I know, very common in environmental work, is just this like sense of like, am I doing this all for nothing? Does this kind of, I guess, ignorant bliss is very appealing at some points, where it just feels like we're going down, and is there like anything we can do to stop it? And everyone's working so hard at it, but there are definitely, that's my biggest obstacle, those moments or those periods where it just feels like this isn't, that all that we're working towards isn't really going to be enough, or that it's not going to, that the high up people who really get to decide it aren't going to side on the right side, I suppose. And that, I think, is a big obstacle, and it's really does a lot, I think, to make me feel disconnected. Because I think it can make you lose sight of what we're doing this for, I guess, and what who this is all about. And it's not, or at least in my opinion, it isn't really about us. It's not really about the people. It's about the earth, and all of this is good. All of the work that we're doing, whatever arena that might be in, is having a positive impact on the earth, and that's what's important. And I hope it works out for the rest of us also, but I think sometimes the despair can make me feel very disconnected from that. I kind of like lose sight of what we're really working towards, and then it helps to just kind of readjust and reconnect, I guess.
So what are the points of disconnection? Give us an example. You talk about despair, but do you, like with your family dog, do you feel disconnected to him or her when you have this despair? Or what is your sense of being together when you have this sense of despair?
I guess With Archie, my dog, he definitely, I notice it. I do notice it there. He's very good at being connected. Like, he's very present. You can see it in his eyes. Everyone who meets him is just like, he is so emotional. Like, he just has such a big heart. And honestly, he's a very good reminder for me, like a grounding kind of presence when you just like look in his eyes and it's like, hello, like you're right there and you see me and I see you and like here we are. And but I notice it if I'm feeling like disconnected, I notice it, I guess, in our relationship, where it's just whether I'm not necessarily meeting his needs in the way that I normally do, or whether he just seems more wary of me than he normally would. And he's really, I mean, he's a people dog. He really likes everybody he meets. So if he's a little more like tentative with his affections, that's a warning sign. But being aware of it, and then that is for me, it's a sign. It's like, okay, we're detaching here, like time to rein it in, connect with him, go on a walk, something like that.
So you're really talking about a personal experience of that the foundation is relational, and that our psyche, our ego, we call it that part of us, which we consider to be separate or different from another beings, starts to intercede.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And yet you do kind of get up and do it again, right? Is there
always?
What can describe that? Does it just happen organically, or is something sparked, or how do you? Because I think we can all appreciate that when you're really down, when you're really depressed. I mean, it's obviously different for every individual, but that's kind of almost the definition, is no exit. So can you describe how that happens, that you sort of regain this revitalizing your sense of oneness, and then from that, this notion of purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a long time for me, that would be doing like my comfort activities, I guess, which like I love to read. So I get like a book that I'm familiar with and just read over very familiar words in like a comforting way, or go on like a long walk in my neighborhood. My neighbors are really like extensions of my family. We're very close with them, and just walking through my neighborhood and seeing people that I love and everybody just kind of doing their thing has always been really grounding and very kind of inspiring to me. I think also, this has only really been in the last 2 months, but I've started meditating, and that has been helpful like nothing else, to just kind of reinvigorate, I guess, my like purpose, my drive. It's also like, I think grounding is a very like, that's kind of a important I guess term for me. That's kind of how it feels when I just kind of get down in it, is I don't feel very grounded or like tethered, I suppose. So meditating and doing yoga, just in the last couple of months, I've really started that, but I have noticed a world of difference. And it really is just, it helps you kind of part the clouds and see more clarity and what you're like really feeling, I guess, which I think it can be hard to kind of tune in on that. But that has been really, I'm very excited about that kind of development, because I've felt just so much change already with it, and I've just started it. So
Well, when you talk about change, from discussing about how you talked about your identity or sense of self. So what do you mean about change? Because the way you're describing it is you're sort of coming back into your original sense of self. Are you also talking about that, maybe two things? One is that you're, regaining yourself again. And at the same time, are you deepening that sense of self and that meaning, from when you first asked that question when you were 5 to your father.
Yeah. Yes. No, I think absolutely. I think there was a period, I think for me, high school was a period where I kind of lost touch a little bit. It was really not an environment that was my kind of environment. So it was just very stressful for me. And I think it caused me to lose touch with myself. And part of this part of meditating and doing yoga and kind of grounding in that has been just going back to that like sense of self that I had as a little kid, and kind of remembering what that feels like and reacquainting with it, and seeing how it's maybe grown and developed since we last like checked in with it, and just kind of getting reacquainted, and definitely like deepening my understanding of it. It's I haven't really ever sat with myself the way that you do when you meditate ever before. So it's definitely perspective broadening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can you describe a little bit like the phase of high school, how that I want to put words in, but how it brought you into more feeling of disconnection? What was it about the experiences that made you feel disconnected?
Yeah, that's definitely something I'm still like unpacking, but I think my high school is the high school for 2 different suburbs outside of Chicago. So it's roughly 4,000 students, which is just enormous. And we're in the suburbs of Chicago, so people come really from all over. There's just a very broad span of people from like really impoverished communities to really wealthy communities. And the dynamics in the school were just very intense. And I'm like a very empathetic person. It is definitely like a blessing and a curse, but in that school, I think I really couldn't detach like what I was experiencing from what everything around me was happening. It was very like overstimulating, I think, like just being in that environment for me emotionally. And I mean, this started when I started high school when I was 14. So I was like you're very young, and I didn't really understand empathy or like my experience of it yet. Not fully, like a little bit, but I was still little. And I think that that kind of overstimulation made my reflex, instead of just like really getting in it and really feeling it and experiencing it, was to kind of suppress it and block it, and not really. It was kind of like my defense mechanism, because the energy was it was toxic. It's not, I know some people have like I don't want to talk too badly about my high school, because it was like, I got a great education, and like I know a lot of people had a really wonderful experience there, but for me it was not my place. And I think that was kind of turning that part of me off a little bit to protect myself from absorbing all this energy and all this kind of toxicity that I really could not process in that moment.
When now you're in university, which is also assuming that there also is an intensity, maybe different kind of intensity. Are there some? Now, you and I have had long discussions about this, but that, for example, now you're an environmental sciences major, and one of the things that you've talked about is or will you talk about here, what you've shared with me, is there a gap then between, you're studying the environment, the concern, obviously everyone has somewhat different concern, but people who are teaching courses within that major, and fellow students and learners, there is a concern of some sort for an interest into the environment. And yet you do feel that there is a gap between your perspective, your sense of oneness and experience of nature, the environment, with what you're learning in school. So can you talk about that and what that feels like and what that looks like?
Absolutely. I think that my program, so my school, it's a Jesuit institution, and they're very passionate about social justice and environmental justice, and these are like pillars of that community. So definitely, in a very broad perspective, they I think they work very hard to promote this community and this oneness within my school's community, within the surrounding community in Chicago, and then also just in terms of an environmental community globally. But the curriculum is really where I feel that gap that you were talking about is, I started out, so I'm an environmental studies major, and I started out majoring in environmental science, with like a focus in restoration and conservation ecology. And I realized within the first like 3 or 4 weeks of school that was the wrong major for me, because the entire path was strictly like biology and chemistry and variants of those two. And I like science. It's like, I appreciate it, but was not what I wanted to spend the next 4 years studying. I was much more interested in the social sciences perspective on environmental damage. And I remember we had a whole conversation, Dr. Bradshaw, in the beginning of my freshman year. I was like, do you think it's okay if I switch my major? Is this gonna like be a huge problem for me going forward if I don't really have this science foundation? And you told me what has stuck with me for the last 3 years is really just that, the science is there. We know the science is sound behind climate change and all of the environmental work. And the problem really is with the humanistic side of it, that people aren't making the changes that science has told us to make. So it would be just as valuable to have, to spend my college career studying why that is the case. More, just as much as it would be to study the scientific aspect of it. And that was invaluable advice. It has definitely been true for me. It's been I'm so glad I made that switch. But still, I notice in my classes that these, that even in conversations about like what we're doing, what we're not doing, we never really talk about like what needs to change within us. It's really very much like, here's what's not happening and here's what needs to be happening. And I don't feel like we've really studied all that much of like, what can we do to improve on what we're not doing to do what we need to do. And for me, I really think that would be just to like, as a community and as just like a world, to just kind of slow down and reevaluate our place in the world and the effect that we've had on it up to this point. And I think that's been a big gap for me. That's felt like a big gap for me, is like, we know what we're not doing, very much like what this webinar is about. Like, we know what's wrong, but what is right and how do we get there? And I think that, those are hard questions. So I get why we're not really studying them, but I also know that there are people who have perspectives on these things. And I think it would be really important. I think it's important to teach young environmental advocates about that, partially because it would give people some hope, I think, because I know despair for me, like that's a big obstacle, and I know that that's not something that just affects me. I know my peers feel it too. So I think knowing like some tactics for improvement would help people find hope, and give them some guidance.
Do you have these conversations with classmates?
I do.
And I know things are a little bit difficult this past year in terms of communication because of the classroom situation is definitely different.
Yes, definitely. I live with two of my very best friends, and neither of them are majoring in environmental science studies, whatever. But we find ourselves talking about this a lot. Because one of my roommates is an education major and the other is majoring in art history. And even in both of those programs, it's like this stuff comes up, because it's it's just very crucial to our like experience of the world, I guess, right now. So we talk about it a lot, and people, because even if you're not like studying it in school, like I know people who are studying something very different but still feel very passionate about this outside of class, and that's just as important, and they feel just as much kind of despair and confusion, I guess, as to what we need to do. So I think we talk about that, and we talk about like what we think we could do just individually. And I just think it'd be helpful to have those conversations on like a grander scale, I guess, a broader scale.
So what are some examples in your conversations about that you think that you should be taught, or that you think that that what you can do would be very important to have that encouraged within an institutional setting?
I think generally like teaching mindfulness from early on would be really important, would be really beneficial to just like help people, because like that's what I'm trying to learn right now through like meditating and doing yoga and everything, is just this like sense of mindfulness and being aware of your like place in all of this. And I just don't think people really, at least my age group, like we haven't really figured out how to do that yet. And I think definitely like by college, but probably even younger, helping people to cultivate that like understanding of themselves and how their understanding of themselves helps them kind of grapple with everything around them would be really helpful, because I think it would also wake people up to the fact that we're like, we're the drivers of all of this, that a lot of the suffering in the world is because of us and because of what we're doing. And I think it's like very easy right now to kind of ignore that. And you don't really have to, we don't live in like a world, or at least I don't, where you really have to grapple with that. It's pretty easy to just kind of sweep it under the rug. Like don't think about it too hard. And then it's like, if you don't really feel that, what's the word I'm looking for? If you don't feel that responsibility, then you really don't, then you're not going to like act on it, because it doesn't feel like your responsibility. So I think from an early age, and if that doesn't happen in a college setting too, would be, and environmental work especially, I feel like you just need to have that kind of understanding of how you're affecting everything around you, because that's like a pillar of like environmentalism, is the like world around you. So how our place in it all, and I think just being more mindful of that would be a really, really good place to start.
Now, it's obviously a lot of the work in the mindfulness area is done under this spiritual teaching umbrella, or courses and other venues. Would you think about, like, for example, one of your courses, you can keep it anonymous, but one of your courses, could it work? In other words, what you're talking about is also it's personal. It's a personal work. you can't do my mindfulness work. I wish you could, but you can't.
Right.
I have to do it myself. So can you imagine, and what would that look like? Or is it even possible for mindfulness and this broader notion of what it entails? Could that be rendered in an institutional setting, like in one of your classes? And if so, what would it look like? What would it look like if you went to class and mindfulness was integrated into X topic that you're being schooled in?
Yeah. I think it would be, I think it's absolutely possible, at least at my school. Since we are a Catholic institution, we're required to take theology class at least at one point throughout our 4 years. And often in each major, you're required to take another kind of theology class. Like for me, that was environmental ethics, which is not theology, but it's under their same kind of umbrella. So usually we're required to take these courses. And I think that this is something that I think could be probably explored in environmental ethics anyways as a class, but each kind of school and each major has these certain classes and requirements that need to be taken. And I think adding a class, at least for the IES, like the School of Environmental Sustainability, which is the school I'm in, adding a class that is, oh, I'm sorry, Archie, it's okay. There you go.
He's saying add another class?
Yeah, he's like, no, don't do that. Yeah, he agrees. Yes, I think adding a class to that kind of curriculum that would focus on like eco spirituality, which I know is a kind of field, and I'm very interested in it. There are no classes in that, so I haven't really learned anything about it yet, but it seems to just kind of encompass like the mindfulness and the kind of spiritual aspect of environmental work. And I think especially at a school that like is pretty progressive in their religion and how they teach it, I think it would be a really I think I could easily see them adding something like that students have to take to graduate. And it's just like maybe just a 1 credit class, like once a week in the evenings, where they just kind of they can teach you how to start on that kind of journey in yourself. And it probably wouldn't take for everybody, but at least for some of the people that maybe have been curious about it or haven't really been able to take that leap. I think it could be a helpful way to kind of start that.
But you're in some ways you're contradicting yourself, because you've been talking about your own view, we'll call it oneness and connection. And essentially the structure and the processes and the teaching is very much non-oneness. I mean, even though there is an effort for integration, et cetera, it's still a bunch of pieces put together of quote unquote collective knowledge, which is totally disconnected from personal experience and perspective. So in some ways, what I think your philosophy and your way of being in the world, what you're really talking about, it would need to be done across the board. It wouldn't be an elective, just like nature has been and is considered still an elective. The fact that there's a school dedicated to the environment, and then there's other schools dedicated that have nothing to do, at least ostensibly, with ecology and the environment. So to a certain extent, like I said, I think you're contradicting, because I think what you're really espousing and embracing and resonate with and would assert is something foundational. In other words, that this is foundational for approaching collective knowledge, that some of the classes that you're studying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I definitely am.
Well, let me just circle back to your original. That was a beautiful discussion. To your arc as such, and then also your feeling of despair and why are we doing this I mean, is this worthwhile? That kind of foundational question. And, we haven't had a very good track record, at least in the US. I'll just limit it to that, in terms of those who are quote unquote higher up, as you put it, in terms of what their efficacy is for making solutions. So let me just go back to that in a sense, what your criteria for achievement is, in the sense of personal, but also in the sense of what you consider to be something that is really looking worthwhile, and understanding that this is making a difference. And I'll tell a little story here that I shared with you earlier, and this is again back in the Pleistocene, and I was doing community work as a scientist. And we had community group gathering, and there was a gentleman in his 80s, and he stood up. And it had to do with the wellness of the watershed that he was living in, and he was born and raised there. And he was in his 80s, and he said his son was in his 50s, and his grandson was in his 20s. And he said each one of us, we're like a step function. So he said my baseline in terms of evaluating what I grew up with in this environment and nature and what's going on in the world is very different than my son's, because my son was born 30 years later. And his starting point and perspective in life was very different. It was 30 years later. And then again, that another step function with the grandson. So the reason I'm saying that is because, in a sense, a lot of our guests and speakers here have been the co-architects and participants, self included, of creating and participating in the problems that we're trying to tackle today. And you and I mean, we all are, but your generation and others are really the inheritors of this. So talk about that a little bit, in terms of what do you see, what looks right? What is your vision of the future? And having that vision, does that give you any perspective when you get into these pits of despair, and understanding that, yeah, this is little, but I've got my eyes on the prize? Does that fit in somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is, in terms of like where I feel like I and my generation is like starting from, is we're like, at least for me, I can't speak for all of us, but I'm very aware that we stand on the shoulders of giants here, like in terms of what has been the incredible uphill battle that has been fought just to get to where we are. That was fought, before we were even born.
Oh, I was talking about the giants that created the problem.
Oh, them too.
Yeah.
We have to contend with them also, I suppose. Yeah, we are not standing on their shoulders, but on the environmentalists, I suppose we are. And I think that in the same respect, because of this kind of despair that I know is not new, but has a kind of urgency now that I don't, it's just, we're very aware that time is running out. We don't really feel like we have time to like grow up and then handle it. It's like, all right, we need to do it now. And kind of who cares how old we are, like it has to happen. And I think that has kind of brought a youth perspective into this movement with activists like Greta Thunberg and everyone working on those Fridays for Future campaigns, which, those are so inspiring. And talk about like when I get into a pit of despair, it's like I look at what those kids are doing and I'm like, wow, okay, we can keep going. This is it's very inspiring. But there is a kind of youth perspective, I think, that is part of this conversation now that really wasn't there before. And I think it serves as a nice or kind of chilling reminder that, like, if we don't get our act together, these little kids, like younger than me, are really not, what world are they growing up into? And is it going to even be there for them to grow up into? And it's, it's kind of bone chilling, in my opinion, to think about that like the little people growing up today, it's like, ooh, but it's a good reminder. And I think it's a really important perspective, that because of this urgency and because of this despair, that young people are feeling today, it's present in this movement in a way that it wasn't before. So remind me of the question. I'm sorry. I think I got a little
you are answering it, but
okay.
you did answer. I kind of gave you like 3 questions in one. so you did answer quote unquote one. I guess the other one is how would you describe your vision for what is right? So in other words, we have these terms of, everyone's happy and peaceful and everything's quote unquote sustainable and et cetera. And for those who are really concerned about our non-human kin, that they no longer have to be subjected to this agenda of anthropocentrism and exploitation. Can you sketch out in some fashion, though, what that really looks like on an everyday basis? I mean, in other words, not what we do, but how are we living? Are we going to be we've had a number of people talking about, well, technology. Wow, we've really got to have, it'll be technology that we really have to focus on because that's going to basically save us. Some people say, no, we have to be subsistence dwellers. I mean, something very concrete, because human culture will be human culture if there's humans around. Yeah. What do you see as important earmarks and what that vision looks like on an everyday basis? I know that's a tall order, but that's really been the motivation for our webinar. And as you pointed out, your generation's, the sort of the normal distribution around you is absolutely critical because this is your world. I mean, in that sense.
Yeah, it absolutely. I think on a day-to-day, there would just be, I think a focus on collaboration would be a good place to kind of start for that. I mean, thinking about like how that would just change the day-to-day. And with food, I think food is a really interesting way to think about this too, because it's like if we were to stop subjecting non-human animals to animal exploitation and to anthropocentrism and all of that, it's like our diet would change as a whole. Like a lot of individual people are obviously plant-based and vegan and all of that, but as a whole, like would have to change significantly. And I think given how critical food is to us, I think that's just an interesting way to kind of frame it for myself, I guess, because like given how fast-paced everything is now, it's like fast food and meals have kind of become less of a like everybody sit down and enjoy and be like grateful for the food in front of us. It's more detached with like drive-throughs and fast food and frozen meals and everything like that. And I understand why, like there's just not enough hours in the day, it seems like, for these things. And I think that that's one place that you see a lot of the kind of damage, like where you see a lot of what's wrong and where like if you're looking to what's right, that would be very different. I think we would obviously everyone would have to have a plant-based diet to stop exploiting the non-human animals, and that would change a lot of industries. I think like people's jobs would shift and the economy would shift because of just how like critical food is to like the way everything kind of functions, I guess, at least in America. And yeah, I guess in terms of like what I think right would be in that respect would just people, it would feel unethical to eat the way that we eat, I guess. And also that there would be systems in place to kind of support that shift happening, because right now it's like impoverished communities really don't have the resources to be vegan and to eat plant-based diets. I mean, that's like, then you start considering the environmental justice perspective on all of this, and it's like you can't really expect these communities that are just trying to like survive to make this very foundational shift that's often like expensive, at least in the grocery stores around here, finding plant-based foods that aren't just like carbs is an expensive shift. And so I think that having working to collaborate with between communities and not have such a division, I think would be helpful. And
I'm going to ask you one more question, because I'm getting vibes from Liz that she's going to put my video off and mute me. But I'm going to squeeze one more question in. Sure. And I think it's a really important question, and that's why I'm asking it.
Yeah.
What can older generations, your teachers, people that you know, us, what can older generations do to support you as a younger generation in terms of turning this world around?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you for that. I think that right now there's a kind of discourse that, like, okay, older generations have we're in this place we are in now, and it's going to primarily affect us and the people younger than me. And older generations, while obviously they care very much about that, it's like, it does seem like now going forward, it is going to continue to fall on us. And I think to just like recognize that it's, yes, like, they have been part of the problem, but that, yes, they can also continue to be part of the solution. Like, just because they're kind of phasing out necessarily of like the generation that's really going to be severely impacted doesn't mean that like their work isn't still valued and appreciated, and that we wouldn't really benefit a lot from it. Because especially like I know for me, it's like I feel young to be like speaking with any kind of authority or like knowledge on this. It's like, who am I to kind of discuss these things when I'm just starting out? And I think especially in those spaces, to have people who have had a whole arc in this arena already to be able to just kind of stand with us in that, I guess I think it adds credibility and a lot of perspective that I think is important for us and helpful.
Thank you so much. I'll turn this over to Liz. Thank you, Olivia.
Of course.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I know I have a couple questions percolating already, but I want to give others a chance first. But before we go into the Q&A, just a quick plug. We will be having our regular Living One event a month from now, so that'll be March 7th. But we also have a very special event coming up. It's going to be an arts panel. It's called Creative by Nature, where we're going to have various artists talking about the intersection between nature and art. So it's going to be a special Living One event. That's going to be February 28th, which is a Sunday at noon Pacific time. So we hope you join us for that. Okay, so without further ado, we'll open it up for question and answers. And Ashley Heron and Lauren Bailey will be assisting me with this. So does anyone have a first question for Olivia? If you don't, I will. All right, okay. Olivia, you were talking about, the idea of teaching mindfulness at an earlier age and how that would be helpful. And that really brought up for me sort of this notion that, one of the things that is really unique about, younger generations, your generation, and even kids that are younger than you are now, is that they've really been immersed in this sort of social media, online persona culture, like from the very beginning. And I was curious as to what your thoughts are on whether that is helpful in terms of having more avenues for connection across the globe, or kind of hindering in that, could it create sort of like this false and maybe less authentic sense of self, and maybe it is somehow antithetical to what you were talking about, which is sort of this internal transformation and being more mindful about who we are from the inside out.
Yeah, I think both. Yes to both. I think social media can really be used for good and for evil. I think that for young kids, like my brother's age, he's 6 years younger than me. So for me, I mean, like social media really, I don't know if this is across the board. I wasn't super like technology focused as a kid. So for me, it wasn't really a thing till I was like 15 or so. So I was older. For my brother, it's been around for his, like all of his life, really. I mean, since he was, could like remember, it's been a thing. And I think that that's damaging, honestly. I think it can be used for good, but I think that kids are so young when they're kind of introduced to it. They don't have the kind of maturity, I suppose, to like not because they're immature, just because they're like children, to maybe recognize that like these things you see on social media are social media. They're not always reflections of real life, and often are not reflections of real life. And I think it can kind of warp your perspective of yourself, and just like really doesn't do good things to your confidence, I don't think, for young kids to be having all these avenues to kind of compare themselves. And I don't think it really promotes that kind of inner sense of like growth and mindfulness. I think it is antithetical to that, but in a different way. And I think in a way, at least, I know you can kind of cultivate your social media to reflect what you are interested in. And in that respect, it's like which is something I've experienced now in the last couple of months, when you kind of become interested in these things, or you kind of open, there's a lot of resources available on social media and ways to get connected to other people who are experiencing the same things you're experiencing, or who have experienced them and are like on the other end. And in that respect, I think it can be a very powerful thing for good. And I know a lot of organizations also who are primarily, like, their main form of like advertising is on social media. There's an organization called Start the Wave that I've recently kind of uncovered that is really incredible. They work to like uplift and promote grassroots initiatives for positive change in a lot of different ways. And their like primary avenue for fundraising and advertising and all of that is through social media. And so in areas like that, I think it can be used for a lot of good, but I think in most up to this point, it maybe hasn't been.
Do you think that it's an obstacle to connecting to the natural world?
Yeah, I think if it continues to be kind of used in the way that it's being used, where it's really just kind of a distraction more than anything else, yes, I think it really is an obstacle to connecting with the natural world, especially just, I mean, aside from other things, it's like keeps you from going outside and just doing other things. It's like it's tempting to just stay stay inside and like focus on the screen and the social media, and it's kind of distracting, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's very insightful.
Hi, Olivia. Just while we're waiting for some other questions, I just thought, well, one, a statement, and then two, there's sort of like two questions in one, if that's okay. So first of all, I agree with everything you've said. And when I went to university to begin with, I was studying animal behaviour. And I had a very similar experience to you, where I enjoyed the course. I learned a lot, but it was very disengaging. It was a lot of contradictions in what was being taught. More so because they were teaching about all these scientific experiments that were on animals, and then teaching us about animal intelligence. So I can completely understand where you're coming from in the fact of environmental science. So I guess my questions stem from one, how do you think education can change in that sense? What do you think should change to still teach the content but without exploiting animals? And I guess my other question comes from, so I'm training to be a primary school teacher, and I think kind of related to what Liz was saying, how can you engage young children, not necessarily giving them the nitty gritty of a lot of information, but just getting them involved in the environmental issues, the animal issues early on in life in the education system. Sorry if that's confusing.
No, absolutely. I think, to answer your first question about the university, I'm sorry, can you repeat that one?
So I guess my first question was sort of, how can the education system, like more so higher education system, what do you see that change looking like, where the content is still being taught, you're still learning about these issues, but without that sort of contradiction in place, I guess.
Yeah, I think the order that the information is taught is important. For instance, if you're going to be learning about animal intelligence and these studies that have been done on animals, teach about the intelligence first and give people a foundation I don't really know what that teaching looks like, but if it's anything like the curriculum at Carruthers, which it probably isn't, but if you give people like a foundation in understanding that they're not like separate from us, that a lot of the like cognition, emotions, like feelings, experience is very similar, and just to kind of start with that, I guess, and make them not this like other thing, so that when you move into understanding the like scientific studies and all of that information that is important, you're looking at that not from a lens of like we're studying some other entity, but we're studying now these beings that we've already become acquainted with on a deeper level, so that it isn't so divisive and othering. I think that would be a good place to start. And for younger kids in like primary school, I think just getting them outside. I mean, like community gardens. I know my elementary school had a community garden that you would go on like Earth Day, and everyone would kind of volunteer and do weeding and all of that. And they made it really fun, and just kind of promoted that. I know for me, like my family as a kid, we did a lot of camping and a lot of hiking and all of that. So that was already something that I was kind of exposed to. But for friends of mine whose families don't necessarily like to do those kinds of things, having a place in school where you kind of really get into the dirt and just like plant something and watch it grow and just see that kind of before your eyes, because that's just a super cool thing. And I think kids would find that really cool. And it would just kind of promote that like love for the earth, that like this nice experience that you're having is because of the environment that you're standing on, and that kind of gratitude for it. And but yeah, just gardening, and I think spending time outside and taking walks in nature, and immersion. I think that would be sounds nice to me.
No, I completely agree. Thank you. I think I agree with you, because I mean, I take part in a lot of forest schools at the school I'm at now, and the children love it. And I think that there is that disconnect where young children, one child said to me the other day, we were planting vegetables and like, digging up the vegetables. And they were like, oh, I didn't realize like vegetables were sort of grown in the ground. And it was one of those things where we expect that children, they know that, but I guess I agree completely with what you're saying, that disconnect is where it sort of stems from. And if they're just taught those small, like vital life tools, then that engages them with the curriculum and everything. So no, I completely agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
So again, I want to get back to, you said it was a major shift for her to start meditation and mindfulness training. And I'm filling in the dots, but I think you actually have expressed this, where it is foundational for you now. In terms of your perspective on life and how you approach things. And it differed from, for example, say 2 months ago, than when you went to class and you took the class. And now when you go to that class, your perspective is very different. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So what about having, that earlier question about how do we inculcate, as we're talking about in these various ways, why not have all these quote unquote institutions be where they teach love? So, that love is the foundational teaching, and it's expressed in environmental studies or engineering. That's a fun one to think about. I know a lot of engineers. I wish there was one here right now. He would love it, but he would be having a lively conversation. I mean, the reason I'm asking that is because that's the logical extension of your experience. So essentially, where you've been put into the limelight here is saying, look into the future and look back. So in other words, if we start teaching love, and then we can teach these other quote unquote objective studies, but through the lens of love. What do you think about that?
I think that would be so great. It just sounds like healthy in a way that I think education sometimes cannot be, that it gets a little, in the same way that, I sometimes forget what we're working towards with environmentalism. You sometimes forget that the purpose of going to school is to learn things. And it's not about, your productivity or your grades or this or that. And the other thing, it's gotten kind of blurred. The purpose of going to school is to learn to be like a healthy, good, foundational member of the world. And I think starting with love, teaching people to just love themselves, love others, love the earth, love whatever it may be, would be just really, it would be really healthy. I think it would have an incredible effect on people and an incredible effect on the education system in America, at least. And really just sounds like a utopia to me.
Thank you.
I add 2 cents on this. It really strikes me that, in our culture in general, there's really sort of a limited view of love, that there needs to be more of a pantheon understanding of love, because it seems like our culture kind of, only sees it in the lens of, there's romantic love, eros, if you want to call it that. I mean, you look at, popular culture, shows like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette and stuff like that. I mean, it's very surface level, and, platonic love and all of those different shades, in between. And I think is really unrecognized. And I think that that's, very detrimental as a whole and part of the obstacle, because, you say, how about we teach love? And right now, I mean, it would concern me that the main thing that people would push back on is, I don't need more sex education for my kids or whatever, because people have just this singular understanding. So it seems like there needs to be a teaching of, or reimagining or remembering of what love and all of its diversity, right? We talk about ecological diversity. Well, the diversity of love, I think would be really important. And, sort of building on that, and going back to what, Lauren was talking about in terms of, having these moments of joy or fun in education, and how it really gets sort of sucked dry by the time you're, in university and in some chemical biology course or something like that. And that brings me to a question, which is, what do you think it is about our education system where we somehow equate having fun or joy with like anti-academic, or that we're somehow slacking off or doing something wrong, or that our pursuits are less valuable than if we're completely bored and rigorous?
Mm-hmm. I think that would come down to just like, I think that's an extension of the way and I really am just speaking about America here because I don't know about the rest of the world, but I think the way that our just society runs is we value productivity, and we value profit, and we value everything that gets you to one of those two things. And if it doesn't, it's seen as less valuable, and like it's something that is less important to be working towards. And I think the education system has started to reflect that. At least my education system has it, where you feel, when you're prioritizing things that maybe aren't your homework or your test scores, if you're prioritizing other things like learning the material, and if it takes you forever to read this one document and you don't get to something else because you really think that's the important thing, you still kind of have this nagging like, well, I'm not really doing enough, I'm not being productive enough, I'm not going to score high enough, or whatever the reflection of that may be. And I think that makes you feel so that anything else that you're doing during your day that isn't working towards kind of improving yourself academically, but it's a very narrow kind of academic. I think that this is like kind of seen as this, but then it's not as important, it's not as valuable, because this other thing is what's going to make you profitable and make you productive, and that's really what's important. And so if that's not what you're working towards, it feels wrong in some way. It feels like you're working towards something less important. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think you're dead on, and that indicates to me that there needs to be a shift in values away from sort of product to process or something like that. Yes. I don't know exactly how to frame it, but yeah, thank you.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Just a quick again plug. That's really one of the reasons we're holding this special seminar, the webinar on Creative by Nature, is looking at art as an expression. And its stigmatism is sort of, well, what's your day job? I always share this story of being in Russia, and when you say, what do you do for a living? And I remember hearing someone say, well, I'm a poet. Really? Well, if you say that here, or I'm an artist, it's typically like, what do you really do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you make money?
Yeah. So that's really one of the motivations. The two of the speakers, our guests, are artists actually all three are. One is from the university. Teaches it performance art. And so we're looking at, what are the other epistemes? What are the other ways of knowing, other ways of quote unquote creating education that disable the colonialistic paradigm of what you're talking about too, this productivity, this objectification, etc.
Yeah.
Well, we thank you very much. Probably I won't ask any more questions, or Liz will go after me. So
not true, but I'm glad you've internalized me as a timekeeper. It gives me less to do.
Kind of reminds me of what is it, the alligator in Peter Pan that goes tick tock tick tick, isn't it?
Swallowed the clock,
right?
There is, Nina has a question.
I'd like to add something. I'm much older generation, and I grew up in LA before there were freeways. And I remember catching pollywogs in the creeks and bringing frogs home. And we had a pet weasel at one time, and always had animals. I'd never lived without animals. My daughter, who's a school counselor, just adopted a neglected racehorse. My granddaughter, who has her degree in psychology, is training baby horses.
Wow.
And I feel so grateful and good about how they feel about the world. And I'm really relating to younger generations because I do have grandchildren, 33 and 30, and I'm around a lot of young people, and I see the sadness and the grief and the loss of life and the suicides. My daughter, who's a school counselor, I mean, she tells me some of the stories, and there has to be much more emphasis on emotional intelligence as well as academic intelligence and a connection to the entire universe. I was a mural artist for 3 years, and we all studied Carl Sagan. I worshiped Carl Sagan. I asked him to run for president and cried when he died. But there has to be much more emphasis on connection of everything connected to each other. I'm working with people that Gay knows with Southern Oregon Animal Rights Society. And right now we're really trying to save animals and produce legislation that gives much more protection, like banning coyote killing contests and meeting with our representatives and doing a lot of Zoom meetings, and that everything is connected. And we have to stop this emphasis on materialism. We have to stop, the fuel, climate change. I knew about 35 years ago, an uncle of mine who taught I'm an old Berkeley person, uncle of mine who taught at UC Berkeley started a group 35 years ago called Earth Regeneration Society. I knew about climate change then. And so many people are just, there's so much ignorance. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And people who don't even believe, don't even believe it, or don't believe a lot of the things that are happening. Thank you.
Oh, Nina, while you're here, I'd like you to comment on it. You were talking about growing up in Los Angeles, kind of like I was talking about that gentleman, where, I mean,
generations,
the changes, the negative changes and the sad changes. But I would like you to comment in just even over the last years, there are changes, what we would call positive changes, which I personally find extraordinary. Now, they seem glacially slow relative to the magnitude of what's going on. But do you agree that there's also incredible, just like you were talking about, the coyote banning, as crazy as it sounds, we're trying to get the banning, the Ancus in Jackson County where we are, right? So that they don't bring the circus in for the elephants. I mean,
right.
this feels Pleistocene-like or Holocene. But don't you agree that there are like amazing like reversals of cultural habits and mindsets that are also happening?
Oh, I agree that the positive thing about the digital age, because I grew up with radio, we didn't even have TVs. So we were doing art. We were, really creative children because we didn't have these other things. And that's the sad part of it. But the digital age does connect people. I see these things on the computer, like a group of surfers who started 4 oceans. They've got thousands or millions of people now collecting the plastic in the oceans because they can communicate on the computers. My grandson is a big snowboarder. He's totally aware of what is happening with less snow. He just experienced losing everything in Talent, Oregon, in the fires. 7 vehicles. He lost everything. So grandma's been helping him. But my seeing the importance of nature, what the beaver believers are doing up in northeastern Oregon, showing beautiful ponds that the beavers build to attract more wildlife. They create fire breaks. There's so much to learn. And I get very frustrated with a lot of people my age, I'm 82, who are so into developing their own spirituality and not working on all the environmental issues and not working on all the animal issues, because part of what's happened is due to greed and ignorance. And I think it's up to older people to really get involved and save the world for younger people. My granddaughter said she doesn't even want to have children, you know, it's too scary, too expensive. So
Thank you, Nina. I just wanted to hear from you because it was really important.
I get on my soapbox. I can't shut up.
No, it was important because you have a perspective. And I do think that that's important to keep those in mind. You know, I think we have to break out of the duality of everything's horrible, everything's good. You know, I'm just in conversation, Olivia, you know, with your previous comment. And I think, you know, and Nina, I was kind of probing you that, I mean, it was like, oh my God, the kinds of changes which are what I call reversals. I mean, you would never get anyone talking about beavers, for example. They've all been decimated. You know, there was a woman around here my mom used to go after because, I mean, she moved up here and she plants these apple trees or fruit trees right by the creek. Well, what do you think beavers do? Cool. You know, this is great. Let's chew them and, you know, cut them down, you know. And so she had someone come in, you know, to kill the beavers. And so I used to call her the Marcia Beaver Killer. You know, I said, oh, that's a very famous American Indian tribe, Marcia Beaver Killer. My mother was just like always put a sock in my mouth when we get together. But I mean, those are phenomenal. I mean, you know, those are just local kinds of things. So I guess, like I said, I don't think that there's one positive thing, one negative thing. You know, it's a really looking at it again, the mindfulness meditation. It's the container of seeing all of these different things. And Corey will be speaking eloquently about things like that from the eyes of a dog in his course that's coming up, because he's had very deep experience with meditation, mindfulness, and whatever. But thank you.
I wanted to say last thing, I started meditating with Maharishi in 1964, and I've read many books, Yogananda and many of the other spiritual leaders, and doing yoga. Everyone should do it because it can really save you, and it helps you focus. Mm-hmm. And talking about dogs, my grandson brings his Siberian Husky over here, and he howls like a wolf. And I've always had dogs. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for sharing. And I really am quite curious now as to, you know, imagining, you know, the Southern California in general before all of the freeways and things, because I did live for a time in Santa Barbara, and it was very overwhelming as a country girl coming from the north, you know, and out in the boonies. It was, you know, sensory overload for sure. And so I'm assuming that, you know, in that regard, we have some similarities. But I think that that's why it's so important to have these intergenerational conversations, because, you know, a lot of people who are born now don't necessarily even remember a world that looks like that, you know, if they're born into the fray, as it were. And so I think it's important to share these stories so that we have some sort of memory of what it could, maybe should, you know, look like if we're living in, you know, closer to something that looks like harmony with other species.
And not have terrible things happen, like someone saying, "Who's Joni Mitchell?" That's okay. You don't have to say, "Who is she?" Don't burst my balloon.
We can Google it now, Gay.
I grew up in Los Angeles, but I also lived in Berkeley 37 years. So I've been one who has been tear gassed a number of times. I've been a protester on many issues, Vietnam, civil rights. I marched with Cesar Chavez. And so I've been a people person too, human rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm tired of a lady now.
Well, it's great to be in the room with you and with you all. Do we have any last minute questions? All right. Well, we do appreciate your time and spending part of your weekend with us. We know, everyone has important places to be and people to connect to, human or otherwise. So thank you so much for being here. And hopefully we will see you on the 28th for the arts special, Creative by Nature. And then again on March 7th, where our speaker will be Linda Fisher. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your weekend. And thank you, Olivia.
Thank you so much for having me. I was so grateful to be here.